believe in essential oils. One of my friends was like, I'm putting it in your humidifier whether you like it or not. And I woke up and I was like, I feel like an entirely new person.
Mm-hmm. My sister was a big believer that a lot of your problems could be cured with garlic. So one time I had really bad laryngitis, and I'm not kidding. I ate a whole garlic clove, chewed that whole thing up. My breath smelled like Italian food for like weeks. I don't know how Mike put up with it. Any other wins? Is anybody going wassailing tonight and helping hang the wreath? I will too. I hope we sing songs instead of just having a boombox play All I Want for Christmas Is You. Is anybody going to Hanging of the Greens tomorrow night? Early or late? Maybe. If you're going early, I'm sitting with the president and stuff, wearing my fake leather pants. All right, so couple of quick announcements. I want to take a look and see how many people have completed course evaluations. Let's go ahead and do that. Because I said if we hit 75%, I will give you extra credit. All right, we are at a whopping 56%. 10 out of 18 of you have completed them. If you are not one of those 18, you may want to complete them. If you would like extra credit. If you don't want extra credit, that is fine. But maybe your classmates want extra credit. I don't know. I can't read your mind. All right, so the last time we were here, we were talking a little bit about the relationship between language and thought. Also, I want to check and see if we have any other big surprises. I just want to make sure. I'm always afraid I'm forgetting a quiz or something like that. Oh, in fact, I am. I need to post a quiz and I should have posted it this morning. I did not. I will give you a little extra time to take it. So how about I make it due on Tuesday instead of on Monday? Because y'all will have you'll have your video project to work on, your writing assignment to work on. So I'll go ahead and extend the deadline for that quiz, kind of to make up for the fact that I forgot to post it. It's ready. I just need to go into e-learning and click a few buttons. Okay. So one of the things that we were kind of talking about before we left is the relationship between language and thought. So there are some possibilities here. So language could be a product of cognition. Cognition and language can function as two separate systems that are independent of each other, but do interact with each other. Or the idea that if we didn't have language, the way that we think about things would change. So the idea being that our cognition is dependent upon language. So this last idea is what is sometimes known as the Whorfian hypothesis or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this comes from anthropology in some aspects, but the basic idea is that language determines how you view the world. If you do not have a word for a certain color, the idea follows that you will not be able to process the world in terms of that color, if that kind of makes sense. So if you don't have a lot of different words for example, different types of textures, you're not going to be able to think of things in terms of that texture. So one of the very famous examples that Whorf and others have given is basically the idea. And let's be very clear, when I first heard this growing up, it was basically the concept that the Eskimo people have many different words for snow. Let's first get one thing out of the way. Eskimo is not actually a proper term. What we would consider that are actually a variety of different native tribes, including the Inuit and the Yupik. Additionally, depending on who you talk to, different groups of native peoples have differing words for snow. So this gets brought up a lot. And so I wanted to refer to a magazine I like called Mental Floss. And so This was published in 2013, and it's basically how many words do quote unquote Eskimos really have for snow? I once heard that it was like 30. There are a whole lot of answers to this question, a heck of a lot, not that many, and a whole heck of a lot. Or if you want specifics, 5, 2, and 99. And that's because there is no single Eskimo language. It is a loose term, often considered offensive for the Inuit and the Yupik peoples living in the polar regions of Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Siberia. They speak a variety of languages, the most common ones being Central Alaskan Yupik, West Greenlandic, and Inuktitut. There are multiple dialects for each, and some have more words for snow than others. So the idea behind this is that if you have a lot of different words for snow, you are going to be able to perceive differences in different types of snow that people like you or I, who may only have one word for the different texture, will not. So the idea being that having more words influences your perception of how you see that thing. So today you will see this everywhere. This was starting to be used in the late 1950s. So anthropologists and psychologists kind of talked about this between the relationship between language, culture, and perception. If polar peoples carved up the word of snow into 4 or 5 categories, whereas English speakers had 1, was their perception of snow different from Westerners? From there, the idea spread to popular culture, where the original sources mentioned 4 or 5 specific snow in the hands of the public. I heard at least 200 growing up, and I know that's not true. The trope did not exist to give information about Arctic languages, but to say other people sure look at the world differently. Now, it turns out that there aren't a lot of different words for snow. It turns out that there could just be 2 or 5. So in the case of West Greenlandic, the answer is 2. Conic, snow in the air, and aput, snow on the ground. And they do kind of have different textures there. There are also terms for snow that use different roots. So in some cases, there could potentially be 5. In certain cases, up to 99. But it really depends on the language, and to just lump it into, hey, this group of other people, who, depending on the area, are either Indigenous Americans or Indigenous Europeans. In the case of, is Greenland Europe? I don't really know. But Indigenous Greenlandians and so on, hey, these Indigenous people have a lot more words than we do. And I feel like, well, that's just really iffy in a lot of different ways. So the question is, does this actually affect how snow is perceived? And so this is a very interesting thought experiment. However, what I would say is that ultimately it doesn't really make as much of a difference as you would think. So one easy way that people have tried to test this, if you take sensation and perception with me, I think Karina and Ariana have had sensation and perception. Anybody else here take sensation and perception with me at some point? Okay, you might remember when we talked about color that we talked about the fact that we have very basic color words. So most of our basic color words are very short, like red, blue, green, yellow, orange, and so on. Generally, our basic colors tend to have shorter names. So what's really interesting is that focal colors, those basic colors, tend to have really short names. Now, on the other hand, Zoe is wearing a top today that would be considered burgundy. Burgundy is a shade of red, but it is not a basic color. Compare red, a focal color, to burgundy, a non-focal color. Can anybody give me another example of the difference between names for focal colors and non-focal colors? Okay, Allie and then Sarah. Okay, so sometimes adding additional modifiers like sky blue, light blue, navy blue, etc. Sarah.
Our school colors were crimson and gold, not red and yellow, as people often. to pink, even though they were quite close, because like we couldn't really put gold on like, there's typically not a gold option. Unless you're in like person, it's typically like yellow or brown. But our school colors were like yellow and gold when you were in person, but oftentimes we like looked at pictures if it wasn't an object to like that's yellow.
Yeah, Zoe. Okay, aquamarine and blue, vermilion and red. I would actually say Sarah's hoodie today looks like goldenrod, which is kind of an offshoot of yellow. So the idea being that our most basic colors that we tend to very easily view the world in are often going to have very short names. Now, there are some exceptions to this. So for example, Sada's hoodie almost looks like sage. It almost looks like it's sage in color. That's a short offshoot of green. So under certain circumstances, you can have shorter words, but generally the overall rule is that focal colors are short, non-focal ones are not. Here's another good example of a non-focal color. Pantone always does their color of the year, and this year it is a shade of magenta. And magenta is most definitely a non-focal color. Now, let's talk a little bit about how and whether having different names for color terms affects how we perceive color. And so researchers have actually looked at an indigenous group of people from New Guinea, the Dani people. They only have 2 different color terms. They use mili for cold or dark hues, and mola for bright and warm hues. So ideally, if you've only got these 2 different colors, if the Whorfian hypothesis holds, they should perceive color differently. And it turns out that they don't. Now, here's what's really critical. You do have to control for color familiarity and color name familiarity, at least when you're comparing performance to English speakers. But what we do find is that compared between the 2 groups, there is no difference in color perception despite having different words. So it seems to me that language does not necessarily, thought does not depend on language. Your perception is the same whether you have a word for it or not. All right, everybody good? Okay, no, not yet. Okay, I saw Emily shake their head. You need a little more time? Okay, Zoe, you need some more time? Okay, anybody else? All right, so what do we find? Generally, the original researchers did find that it was easier for English speakers to process focal colors, but the problem there is that when we're talking about focal colors, you see these all the time and the names are really automatic for you. And so it could be the fact that it's due to language, or it could be that it's due to familiarity. So when you control for familiarity by giving nonsense names to focal and non-focal colors so that English speakers don't have a language advantage, what we find is that both the Dani and the English groups did well with focal colors and perceiving focal colors compared to non-focal colors. So language does not influence how you perceive things. Does it modify how you describe things? Sure. If I don't have a variety of different words for snow, I'm going to be like, oh, it's that, but I'm probably going to talk about snow in a way like that snow looks like rice. So maybe I don't have a word for that particular texture, but I can bring in other words I know to aid my description. But that's just affecting how I talk about it. It does not seem to affect how I perceive it. So the Whorfian hypothesis, while very fun to think about, is generally regarded as bogus. Fun thought experiment, kind of bogus. Okay, everybody good? Okay. So here's the reverse of this. So does language depend on thought? And a lot of researchers have suggested that language is a tool that helps us communicate our thoughts. So we have thoughts, but language gives us another opportunity to explain what is going on inside and share that information with others. And Aristotle actually talked about this. You knew I was going to work my philosophy minor in somehow. Aristotle actually said that we have different categories of thought, and ultimately that determines how we speak about those things. Are we speaking about things in terms of causality? Are we speaking about things in terms of association? Now, some evidence that we have that language depends more on thought is that for the most part, your cognitive processes occur before your language abilities do. So those of you that have had me for other classes, we have talked about looking time studies where infants will look more and spend more time looking at things that are novel or surprising compared to things that are expected. And we have actually found that when we use things like looking time to figure out what infants are capable of, we learn that they are capable of basic mathematical operations like 2 + 2 = 4, or taking 1 away from 2 leaves 1. So basic math operations. We know that they understand object permanence. We know that they understand cause-effect relationships. And they even understand biological concepts like life and death. Now, are they going to understand those on the level of you or me? No. You're not going to be able to do looking times and see if an infant is capable of doing trigonometry or an algebra problem. So we're not talking about very complex things, but we are beginning to see those very early understandings of complex thought, and they are doing this before they are even able to speak. And I would also add that the reason that infants are able to form language at all is because they are looking at statistical regularities when they hear speech. So researchers have actually given infants nonsensical strings of speech, and infants have been able to, through looking time studies, they're able to find the boundaries of where one word ends and the other begins, despite the fact that they've never heard this language before. So they're looking at what is statistically likely to be able to determine where word boundaries are. And again, all of this happens before they talk, which kind of indicates that language cognition comes before language, and language enables us to talk and communicate our cognitive processes to others. All right. So it's an interesting idea, right? Maybe. Well, here are some other pieces of evidence that we have for this. So first of all, going back to our color words, remember that our focal colors are our most basic colors. And what we actually find is that our visual system is maximally sensitive to 3 major focal colors, not vocal colors. What would vocal color is tone quality. That's not what we're talking about here compared to focal color. So our visual system is maximally sensitive to 3 different focal colors: red, blue, and green. Additionally, the other focal colors that we have are based off of combinations of those focal colors. So when you mix red and green light, you get yellow. When you mix red and blue, you get violet light. And when you mix all 3 of them together, you get white. We're talking about light, not pigments. When you mix pigments, we get nasty brown or gray. We're talking about light here. So most of our focal colors are based off of those different combinations of those three. Now, let's also talk about languages and our word order. So every language that you will encounter has a preferred order for subjects, verbs, and objects. So right now in the English language, we are what are known as an SVO language. Our language is made up of a subject, a verb, and then an object. If you go to other languages, it is going to differ. So for example, I am learning Korean, and in Korean, it is actually an SOV language. So in this case, you get the subject, then you get the object, and then the verb comes at the end. But here's what's really critical. In all of the world's languages, the majority of our language, regardless of what language we speak, we always have the subject come before the verb. Now, it doesn't have to be right before the verb, but the subject always comes first and then the verb in some form. And so we do seem to have an understanding that there are agents that act. And so only 4 out of 6 possible combinations of S, subject, verb, and object are going to be used in natural languages. So here are, so subjects will always come before objects as well. So here are all possible orders and frequencies basically expressed in percentages. So 44% of the world's languages are SOV, like I mentioned with Korean, subject, object, and verb. And Japanese would be another example. English is an example of an SVO language. That is 35% of the world's languages. Follow that order. Gaelic and other languages, about 19% of the world's languages, have verb, subject, and object. And then finally, 2% of the world's languages, including Fijian, which is spoken by the people in Fiji, are verb, object, subject. Now, here's what I want you to know. Generally, the subject is almost always coming before the object. So an agent acts upon the object and the object is affected by the agent's action. This indicates an understanding of cause-effect relationships. Very few languages have the subject come or the subject come after the object. And here's what I want you to know. Nobody has a language that is object, verb, subject, or object, subject, verb. Most of the time, with the exception of 2% of the world's languages, 98% of the world's languages always have a subject coming before an object. Everybody good? Okay. So are thought and language independent from each other? So this is a special case. This is what is sometimes referred to as the modularity position. So at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about the fact that you have different types of modules, that there are different parts of the brain that are specific for very different purposes, and they can connect with each other, but they operate independently of each other. And so some evidence that we have that thought and language are actually separate modules comes from looking at those people who have deficits in language but not thought. So meaning that they might have deficits in language, but not necessarily in intellectual abilities, versus those who do not have linguistic deficits, but do have intellectual deficits. Are your hands doing okay? Yeah, I had an issue with my elbow yesterday. I was pointing in class and it hurt to even lift my elbow. I think I slept on it funny.
That's just from surgery.
I'm sorry.
Maybe you're getting old. I have to look forward to something.
I think I know, I might know something about that, not the arthritis, but I do know something about getting older. I'm now being sent mailings telling me about certain types of screenings that I never needed to get before. Yay. Okay. So I want to talk about these two different instances, these two different disorders that have been used to kind of explain why thought and language might be independent from each other. Is there anybody here who is not familiar with Williams syndrome? Okay, so what you kind of see with Williams syndrome, it's a genetic disorder and it does produce very severe intellectual deficits. However, what is very interesting about Williams syndrome is that that people with Williams syndrome, their language abilities are not affected by that. They are actually very charming, very friendly people. And as you can kind of see, because of the nature of the disorder, they also have very distinct facial features. They tend to have very big smiles and almost elfin-like faces. But they're generally very charming people. But unfortunately, because they are so social, but they have these intellectual deficits, they can be taken advantage of in a variety of different ways. And we're going to watch a quick little video about Williams syndrome. You won't let me do it. Well, first of all, let's stop share and we're going to pause recording.